Cameroon, oh Cameroon, cradle of our ancestors, a relic from the 30s, claims to cling to political power in Cameroon. His name is Paul Barthélemy Biabi Bono. Born on the 13th of February, 1933, in Vomeka. A statement published on his X page, formerly Twitter, tells us that Paul Biya is supposedly a candidate for an 8th election, that is, an 8th electoral masquerade, at the head of Cameroon after 43 years in power. He has never obtained through a democratic election. Paul Biya is a civilian putschist who was installed at the head of my native country, Cameroon, by French colonialism and neo-colonialism, and who subsequently has held onto power through violence, cunning, corruption, and lies. That is what he is. Starting in 1961, recommended by Dr. Louis-Paul Adjula, a French colonialist in Cameroon, Biya entered the political administration of Cameroon and has remained there to this day, living off the luxuries and privileges of the Republic, living off Cameroon's public assets, and never once declaring his wealth to our people. Today, President Paul Biya is an impressive 93 years old, a significant milestone. Paul Biya no longer enjoys most of his physical, moral, or mental faculties. Paul Biya is an old man who, due to his senility, is in reality physically and mentally disabled. He is, in fact, incapable of carrying out. Thank you for sharing this program. Thank you for sharing it with those who don't know or who pretend not to know our positions on Cameroon. From 1945 until 2025, there has never been a real electoral consultation in Cameroon. There has never been an election in the true sense of the word. A free, transparent, and fair choice and indisputable choice of the country's leaders by the people. The former single-party regime, which lasted from 1960 practically until 1990, was a regime that sometimes held so-called elections, but which were in fact plebiscites decreed by the ruler with the support of France. What has been called multipartyism since the 1990s is another kind of fraud, where, through the Ministry of Territorial Administration, then later ONEL, and then ELECAM, the tyrant rigs the process, proclaims himself elected, imprisons those who challenge him, massacres those who oppose him, exiles those who resist, corrupts those who submit, and extends his power, along with his oligarchy of incompetents, thieves, and fraudsters of every kind. In this year, 2025, Paul Biya is not a candidate in an election, because to be a candidate, there would have to be a competition. There is no political competition in Cameroon. And why are there no elections? Because he alone holds the secret to the electoral lists. He alone controls the Electoral Commission and the CA means he alone controls the Constitutional Court of Cameroon, which is authorized to arbitrate electoral disputes. He alone controls the defense and security forces, including the intelligence services. He alone controls the country's financial administrations, and he abuses all these powers. This has been the case since he came to power, exactly like his predecessor Ahmadou Ahidjo, from 1960 to 1982. Today, Paul Biya is unable to exercise power. We have seen this in his inability to move physically, to physically move his own body. We have seen it in his physical disorientation, his psychological disorientation, his mental disorientation during his rare public appearances. We have seen it in the increasing number of blatant absences in even the apparent exercise of his duties as head of state and president of the republic. Since 2019, a nefarious decree has delegated the powers of the President of the Republic to his Secretary General at the Presidency. And the entire country operates using a magic formula, on the high instructions of the President of the Republic. Yet, this President of the Republic is absent all the time. He appears from time to time, giving the illusion of actually exercising power, when in reality, he himself is being used as a mascot, as a puppet, to legitimize the oligarchy which for several years now has been making decisions in his place and has usurped the functions of the President of the Republic. Under these circumstances, it is important to recognize that participating in an election that is not really an election, in other words, a sham election, means contributing to the final legitimization of the scam that rules Cameroon. First under Ahijo's single-party regime, then under Biya's single-party regime. But the scam that rules Cameroon has become even more violent since, hindered by the handicap of his advanced age, by senility, by illness, his bedridden status. Biya is being used by a clan of kleptocrats, a clan of state criminals, to seize and hold on to power. And in all of this, there are two competing plans. The first plan is to ensure that this old man dies in power, to give him a state funeral, because he is afraid of ending up like his predecessor, whom he drove out of the country. Let me remind you that Biya prevented a state funeral for his predecessor, Amadou Ahijo, in Cameroon. He left Amadou Ahijo's remains lying in Senegal at the Dakayoff Cemetery up to this very moment. So Biya is terribly afraid of dying out of power, because whoever comes to power after him could in turn deny him a burial in Cameroon, according to the law of karma. So he has decided to do everything possible to die in power. And in this scenario, he has planned that after his death, the friend of Ray Boba, Abubakari, who is the vice president of the Senate, and who is actually the real president of the Senate, behind the fake president, another mascot, another completely senile puppet, Marcel Nyat Nifendi, it is planned that he, within the time frame set by Biya's blatant and scandalous constitution, will organize a rigged election in favor of Paul Biya's son, Frank Biya, who is already preparing for it since by natural death. Due to his advanced senility, his advanced old age, Mr. Biya could at any moment, quite naturally, pass away. So, in this first scenario, they are preparing us to establish a dynasty in the style of the Bongos in Gabon, the Debis in Chad, the Yademas in Togo, or in the style of the Nguema dynasty in Equatorial Guinea, or like the one being prepared in Congo-Brazzaville, the Sassou Nguesso dynasty. They are preparing us for that. That's the first plan. That's the plan Biya is committed to. To achieve this, he has already introduced his son to successive French leaders. In particular, he introduced him as such to François Hollande. Then, he introduced his son in the same way to Emmanuel Macron, trying to reassure France by telling them, everything will go smoothly. If I'm not here, he will take over. Biya went even further. He went to introduce his son to Putin. He took him along, even though he holds no official position. He brought him to Russia and introduced him to Putin, saying, if I'm not here, he will take over. In the country, Biya made pacts with a number of influential tribal groups and traditional chieftaincies, such as the Lamidat of Ray Boba, led by Abubakari, his ally, and the Bamoun Sultanate, where he has traditionally had allies, especially since the time of the late former Sultan, Ibrahim Bombojoya, and his successor. He has locked down a number of important traditional chieftaincies in the country in this way, and has already sent them the message that if he is no longer there, it will be his son who carries on. And he has worked to secure the loyalty of these chieftaincies through pacts, gifts, promises, and guarantees whose details remain known only to them for now. That's what he has done. So, in this first scenario, we are heading toward the dynastization of Cameroon and the continuation of the current dictatorship from father to son, a bit like the Duvaliers in Haiti. If this comprehensive plan were to unfortunately fail due to significant opposition from the Cameroonian people, the French neo-colonialists have already meticulously prepared a second, alternative plan to effectively maintain the existing neo-colonial regime, still stemming from French, British, and German neo-colonial domination and the genocide of more than 1 million Cameroonians between 1955 and 1971. The plan is to bring forth a military figure from the core ranks of the Cameroonian army who will seize power, giving the impression of leading a revolution. But in reality, it will be a palace coup modeled after that of Oligui Nguema, Brice Clotaire in Gabon, or Doumbouya Mamadi in Guinea-Conakry. In order not to be caught off guard by the popular Pan-Africanist revolution, neo-colonialism, in order not to be surprised by this revolution, neo-colonialism has planned a military backup option that will simulate a revolution, but in reality, will maintain the core interests of French neo-colonialism and Western imperialism in Cameroon, preserving the old order behind the facade of a military regime, which will be nothing more than a transition from Paul Biya's civilian dictatorship to the military dictatorship of a France-Afrique loyal officer. This is the second plan. But this plan does not depend on Paul Biya. This second plan depends on Paul Biya's masters, the French neo-colonialists, who do not want to be caught off guard. That is why, whether it is the ongoing civilian coup of the dynasty or the neo-colonial military coup, we call all of this Plan A, meaning the maintenance of domination. So, what is Plan B? For a very long time, Plan B for Cameroonians consisted of thinking that they could win the presidential elections and force the despot to acknowledge his defeat. That has never worked. It hasn't worked since 1945. It didn't work in 1992. It didn't work in 2018. It will never work as long as the balance of power remains as we see it. The capture of the Electoral Commission, the capture of the Constitutional Court, the capture of the Constitutional Council, the capture of the military apparatus, the capture of the financial administrations, the capture of the diplomatic apparatus. As long as this regime holds each of these structures in its hands, there can be no change brought about through peace and the ballot box, as some political opponents have claimed. That is why, at the head of our movement of the indomitable lionesses and lions for the Pan-African liberation of Cameroon, drawing all the lessons from the impossibility of political change through electoral means in Cameroon, since, in reality, there is no electoral pathway, are calling for a popular mobilization, a peaceful mobilization, and we are calling on all the vital forces of the Cameroonian nation, including those within the security apparatus, to work towards the advent of a political transition that will allow us to define the conditions for a new Pan-African Federal Republic of Cameroon. Only this path, revolutionary, popular, and peaceful. Only this path, mobilizing patriots from all the fundamental forces of the country. Only this path can save Cameroon. That is why it is necessary to align Cameroon with the Pan-Africanist revolution currently underway in West Africa, to draw inspiration from the model of Mali, the model of Burkina Faso, the model of Niger, to free Cameroon from the double domination of local feudal oligarchic forces and international neocolonialist and imperialist powers. It is this approach that led me, together with my comrades from within the country and the Cameroonian diasporas, to found the movement of the indomitable lionesses and lions for the Pan-African liberation of Cameroon. I want to remind everyone once again that in 2025, what is happening in Cameroon is not an election. Paul Biya is not a candidate for anything. Paul Biya is the hostage of a gang of white-collar state criminals who govern this country. Rather, plunder this country using the magic phrase, on other instructions from the head of state. We are collectively responsible for preventing the dynastization of Cameroon, the monarchization of Cameroon, for stopping Mr. Biya from seizing state power so it can be handed over to his son. We are collectively responsible for preventing a military coup carried out for interests foreign to the Cameroonian people. We are collectively responsible for doing everything we can to take back this country as the people, as Africans of Cameroon. From a Pan-African consciousness, the Cameroonian people must astonish the world. And it is this work of mobilization, this work of raising awareness, this work of surpassing ourselves that we have undertaken. It is beginning to bear fruit because a significant part of the political opposition, which believed it could go through the so-called channel of the ballot box and peace, is seeing this channel narrow day by day. As we move forward into this year, 2025, several opposition candidates who thought they could at least take part as mere figureheads in this childish election are realizing that they might even be prevented from simply being candidates because they don't even want them to say that they won, but that their victory was stolen from them. The dictators of South Africa have decided to provoke pre-electoral crisis in order to avoid electoral and post-electoral crisis. Let me explain the method. Before the so-called election, they exclude everyone who could claim an electoral victory. They exclude them first. They set them aside. They organize the electoral circus between the dictator and some stand-ins, some token opposition figures. Third, they later share power with the token opposition in the framework of a so-called national unity government. And that's the end of it. The country remains under domination. Many opposition activists who didn't listen to us a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, or even just 3 months ago, are starting to realize that Cameroon cannot be freed unless we collectively decide to first put an end to the obstacle to scrutiny, the obstacle to taking into account the voice of Cameroonians, namely the Paul Biya regime. The Paul Biya regime cannot accept losing the elections it organizes. Impossible. Therefore, for there to be real elections in Cameroon, and for those who lead Cameroon to have been chosen by Cameroonians, we must start by dismissing Paul Biya, dismissing the Paul Biya regime, dismissing the impostors who use the old man as a mascot, as a puppet, to seize control of the country. As long as we haven't found a solution to put an end to this succession of impostures that has been called an election, which we call an election, we are doomed to continue watching Cameroon descend into the hells of mass poverty, political violence, the hells of a simmering and ongoing civil war, the hells of instability, the hells of hopelessness, and the wide migrations of entire groups of young people to North America, to the deserts of the Sahara, the Mediterranean Sea, and the imaginary Eldorados of Europe. We are doomed to watch this continue if we do not remove the regime that stands in the way of the people's sovereignty. Those individuals who genuinely believe that by actively taking part in Biya's elaborate electoral circus, they will ultimately have more compelling arguments to effectively denounce his oppressive regime, will inevitably be asked to thoroughly present their detailed arguments when this very regime soon announces the unjust exclusion of their chosen candidate. This is the same method that was used in Gabon. Olivier Nguema was asked to start by removing from the election all the opposition candidates who could defeat him. He prevented all opposition candidates who could beat him in the elections from running. He only allowed those who could not claim an electoral victory to participate. This is the same method that was used to impose Mohamed Bazoum as the head of Niger. All the opposition candidates who could have beaten Bazoum were removed. This is the same method being used in Togo. Vogue Nassimbe first hunted down all the opposition figures capable of defeating him in the elections before orchestrating the seizure of power. This is the same method being used by Alassane Ouattara in Côte d'Ivoire. Alassane Ouattara started by excluding all the opposition figures capable of defeating him before announcing that he wanted to hold an election. This is the method that has been recommended everywhere throughout all of France-Afrique. From the perspective of the neo-colonized and the neo-colonizers, pre-electoral crises are preferable to electoral and post-electoral crises. We are living in an era of political exclusion in advance. In previous years, political exclusion in electoral processes occurred after electoral disputes, meaning that, in general, those who were eligible were allowed to run. Then, the results were stolen, the results were rigged, and the opposition would protest. Of course, the courts, completely under the control of the dictatorial executive, would rule against them. They would imprison those they could, kill those they could, corrupt those they could, and the country would gradually quiet down, returning to the peace of the graveyard under the dictatorship. Now, they have chosen to eliminate in advance anyone who might even claim the slightest shadow of victory. They have decided to exclude them ahead of time. They have decided to exclude the diaspora as much as possible, at least in the case of Cameroon. They have decided to take control of the elections and turn them into a discretionary affair. In short, they've killed the election. They killed the election before the election even took place. They killed it. They neutralized everything that even gave the impression it was an election, turning it, in reality, into a disguised plebiscite. So, those who think they can fight electoral fraud after the electoral masquerade haven't understood that electoral fraud nowadays doesn't happen during the so-called election. It doesn't happen afterward. Now, it happens beforehand. The 2025 electoral fraud in Cameroon has already taken place. The 2025 election has already been stolen, just like the one in 2018. It's already done. Just like in 92, it's already done. And that's been the case since 1945. From 1945 to 1959, it was France that organized electoral fraud in Cameroon. Since 1960, it was the UNC regime under Ahidjo that organized them. Since 1982, it's been the BR regime organizing them. That's the reason. So now, we're entering a new phase. African dictatorships are stepping up their game. They exclude people in advance because they don't want to risk electoral and post-electoral crises. They provoke pre-electoral crises. They nip popular demands in the bud, and life goes on. That's what we refuse. LILIPAC refused that. And that's why we are calling on the Cameroonian people to engage in peaceful popular struggle. We are calling on the defense and security forces to support the people's peaceful popular struggle. We are calling on friendly African peoples. We are calling on African countries that support African emancipation to support this movement of the Cameroonian people. That's it. Once again, to sum up, that's my message. There is no election this year in Cameroon. What we need is to keep mobilizing to get rid of the one who is preventing us from having elections, the Paul Biya regime. Not just Paul Biya alone, but his entire regime. Because if Paul Biya is gone, but Frank Biya rises to power or a military officer serving French neocolonialism takes over, it's just a continuation of Kasongo. It's the continuation of misery. It's the continuation of dictatorship. We must put an end to this neo-colonial system.